The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents a debate review, part one, Matt Dillahunty and Dr. Michael Egnor, Does God Exist? Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. This is actually part one of a two-part review because the second part's going to take a long time to put together, probably the next week or two. And it's going to be where it's the first time I have ever done a debate review like this because I didn't really feel like it was needed elsewhere. But there's some really good opportunities here because this debate was a mess and not a debate. So I'm going to be going through and editing it to show what was actually said, removing the fluff, and doing a comparison of who presented arguments, who actually attempted to rebut arguments, who actually answered questions while being accused of tap dancing, who tap danced while pretending that they answered questions. But this is a look at the debate from kind of a meta level with a couple specifics. And the first is that I've done a lot of debates on various platforms on the internet, and there's been a problem, which I've talked about before, which is that there's a group of people who follow me around just to harass and badger and call me names and things like that. But generally speaking, most of my debate opponents have at least attempted to, have some sort of debate. This is the first time where someone has expressly shown up to attack me and then gone on to admit that that was their case later. And so that's kind of what this part's about. The format was pretty straightforward. We would each have 15 minutes for opening statements. The topic was, does God exist? Not, do we have good reason to believe there's a God? Is there evidence for God, etc.? It's, does God exist? Which is a question about the ontology of a God, not a question on whether or not there's an epistemic justification to believe in a God. And I wanted to make sure I addressed that, but also I had a plan, which was to present a version of my argument from divine hiddenness, which is based on other people's as well, but I have a slightly original view on it with a couple of interesting thoughts. And to do that along with some basic epistemology to show when I say God doesn't exist, I'm saying it in the same way that we would say fairies don't exist or leprechauns don't exist. It's not that I can demonstrably prove 100% that those things don't exist. It's that we don't have sufficient evidence to conclude they do exist, and their existence is incompatible with the facts of the world and with the facts that we would expect to see if the claims about them were true. For example, if fairy stories were true, where would we expect to see them and how and what, how would we be able to gather evidence for them? Dr. Egnor evidently just completely missed this part. But in his opening statement, which was 15 minutes, he spent only 10 minutes. And that was for, here's a little introduction and then 10 arguments for the existence of God. Thomas Aquinas' 5 points and others. And then when he finished, the moderator was like, well, you've still got 5 minutes left or 6 minutes left. And that's when he decided that he would use that 6 minutes to pop out a whole bunch of questions that he thinks atheists find troubling, like why is there something rather than nothing? And it's funny because that's a really good question, except that he doesn't have any better answer for it than anybody else. He might as well have said there's something rather than nothing because my magic friend made there be something. It doesn't in any way address why is there something rather than nothing. And my position on that, which I don't think we ever really got to, is that I'm currently of a mindset that there's something rather than nothing because there has to be something, because there can't be a nothing. Nothing can't exist. It's absurd to think there's a nothing. And so there must necessarily be something, or at least it's impossible for there to be nothing. But that gets into something else entirely. I presented that argument from divine hiddenness and a little bit of an introduction to epistemology and skepticism, and specifically talked about, what I wasn't going to do, that I wasn't just going to sit here and say, hey, there's not a burden of proof. Even though atheists don't have to prove that God doesn't exist. He, like many others, go for this hard atheist definition where an atheist is someone who says there is no God and anything else is not. But it doesn't matter whether or not I'm an atheist, what label I use. I could be an agnostic, whatever else. If the question is, does God exist? And he shows up to debate a yes, and I show up to debate, I'm not convinced that yes is an acceptable answer. that is an acceptable position. He's so focused on the fact that I use the atheist label. He has a particular flawed understanding of the atheist label. And so this debate was all about me. This debate was not about whether or not a God exists. From the beginning, he constantly interrupted, was massively rude. And that's when I figured out his plan, because he was like, he didn't present arguments, but he'd talk about Aquinas' 5 points, and then wanted to quiz me like he's the professor and I'm the student, which is exactly, I mean, he is a professor. And personally, it's an embarrassing fact that this individual, who clearly has no capacity for teaching or compassion or anything, at least with regard to atheists, decided to grill me as if I was a student showing up to take a test. When I figured out his plan, you'll see I actually kind of sit back, relax, and I start taking notes, because I had to adapt things on the fly. We'll get back to that in a minute, because Dr. Egnor wrote a blog post after the debate. And what happened was, the person who moderated this debate contacted me afterwards and said, hey, hypothetically, would you be interested in debating Egnor again? And I said, I don't think anybody should debate Egnor again, so no. Well, he passed that information on to Dr. Egnor, because Dr. Egnor was desperate to do more debates. Really, really, really wanted to keep debating me. And that speaks volumes, because he has zero respect for me, and he has zero respect for the process. He has zero respect for the subjects, has no respect for atheists. So why is he so desperate to debate me? It's because, despite the fact that he's an accomplished neurosurgeon, he's part of the Discovery Institute. And all of those people of expertise there are largely disregarded by the larger science community, because they don't understand science and they're not scientists. He's a brain mechanic who doesn't know anything about science in general. And this has been something stuck in their craw for a long time. You go read, P.Z. Myers, Jerry Coyne, all of these other proper scientists and professors will talk about Dr. Egnor and people at the Discovery Institute in incredibly disparaging, comments. And so this is stuck in his craw. And as he, gets closer and closer, I suppose, to retiring, he wants to make a name for himself as a debater. And what better way to do that than to debate me and other prominent atheists? And so when I said I wouldn't debate him again, that stuck in his craw. So he wrote a blog post that says, atheist spokesman Matt Dillahunty refuses to debate me again. And curiously, he posted my bio sketch, which I didn't write. But he said this: Matt describes himself as a strong proponent of debates and endorses debates as incredibly valuable. Ironically, following our recent debate, Dillahunty believes that debates are less valuable. That's true. Well, it's not true. I don't believe that debates are less valuable. I believe that debates with him are less valuable. And there are a few other people who I've decided debates aren't particularly valuable with. You see, go back to somebody like Blake Jonta or any of the other guys that I've debated, where we've debated a handful of times. These are genuine thinkers who are often willing to, acknowledge the burden of proof, but at least when they walk in to the process to have this debate, they're willing to engage, and they're going to do it respectfully. And even when things get contentious, they're not attacking me, and they didn't show up to say Matt's an idiot. They didn't show up to say Matt's going to fail my test. They showed up to defend the concept of God, something that Dr. Egnor doesn't do, which is why I said I wouldn't debate him again. And I don't think anybody should. He has no respect for the process. He definitely doesn't respect atheists, or literally says that we're not atheists. We are, in fact, liars, according to him, and that we don't understand anything and we talk gibberish and nonsense. Why would anybody continue debating that? But he continues to say, quote, in my presentation of the classical arguments for God's existence, I presented about a paragraph on each argument, but didn't go into meticulous detail with any of them. Pause. He didn't go into any detail on any of them. He didn't even necessarily read any of them fully. It was ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. It was a gish gallop through 10 arguments in less than 10 minutes. And he continues, I did this deliberately. I had watched Dillahunty debate this question previously. I've had plenty of experience with new atheists, and it was clear to me that Dillahunty, like every new atheist I've encountered, had no genuine understanding of the arguments for God's existence. Of course, for meaningful debate, both debaters must understand the arguments, and I thought a good place to start would be to see if Dillahunty did indeed understand any of the arguments he claimed to reject. He admitted that he didn't. That's not true. His ignorance of the argument for God's existence became even more clear as the debate went on. I was amazed, but not really surprised, that Dillahunty would devote his life and career to debunk arguments that he didn't understand and that he knew he didn't understand. So first of all, in this kind of slanderous attempt on his part, he's admitting he walked in to give a substandard defense of the subject, did God exist? Does God exist? And his primary thing was he'd seen me debate before. He'd come to the conclusion that I, like all the other new atheists, don't understand the arguments. And so he set up a half-assed presentation in order to quiz me and show what I didn't know. Unfortunately for Dr. Egnor, who doesn't seem to have studied things in such a way that you can actually learn, you study these arguments to conceptualize the topic and to discover what the problems are with them. Now, there are arguments for the existence of God that I can do word for word. The Kalam cosmological argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause for its existence. That's pretty much word for word, at least one of the versions of the Kalam cosmological arguments. But in debates and in discussions, each side is supposed to present their argument, and then they're supposed to discuss it and review it and point out the problems of that. If you don't actually present the argument, if you intentionally present a half-assed argument in order to quiz your opponent on what they understand about it, you're not actually debating. And he admits that he's not. You study these things. Now, I studied Aquinas and other things, 15 years ago or more, and read what a lot of different people had to say about him, thought about them myself, found that they weren't enough, that the arguments on their own weren't supported by evidence, and that, quite frankly, some of the premises that were presented were dubious at best and not demonstrable. It's like the Leibniz cosmological argument, which I've been looking into a little bit more lately, that is based on contingency. I've done a video explaining my thoughts on the argument from contingency, not the Leibniz cosmological argument. But I couldn't quote to you an argument from contingency right now off the top of my head. I don't need to. I'm in a position where I'm responding to arguments that people present. I'm not a walking encyclopedia of everything every theist has ever posited, because I'd like my brain to be a little less cluttered with crap than that. But I've done videos on it. I can do videos on the Aquinas 5 points, and probably will at some point. And if I had said, after presenting my opening, please show me that you understand my argument from divine hiddenness, and then just sat there, which of my premises do you reject? What was my premise? What was this? What was it? Like the way he did, and then not even let him answer, which is what he did. It was pretty embarrassing on his part. I would have been dishonest, and I would have been an asshole to do that, as he was. So back to the debate. The lesson here is about adapting on the fly if you ever find yourself in a debate. And when I realized that he did not show up to defend the proposition or to defend his yes answer to does God exist, and that he had actually showed up to quiz me and expose me as someone who doesn't understand this stuff, you can see me sit back and relax. And I started taking notes, and my notes were all about building up to my closing remarks. And the closing remarks I created on the fly specifically to expose the problems of the debate. I'm very happy with them. And I'll put them up against his closing remarks, which was a parade of nonsense, ending with, let me retract the word nonsense. It wasn't nonsense. Nonsense has a very particular meaning, and I'm going to be using that because he accused me of speaking nonsense and gibberish repeatedly. But he ended with something along the lines of, if you think that everything came from nothing for no reason, you're crazy. First of all, that had nothing to do with the debate. At no point did I ever say that I thought that everything came from nothing for no reason. At no point did he demonstrate that there's a problem with thinking that everything came from nothing for no reason. And my position is that everything didn't come from nothing, but that everything in some form or other probably always existed. But we have no way of testing it. We have no way of confirming it. And so I would say that telling anybody they're crazy shows that you're probably a neurosurgeon, but you're not a medical ethicist and you're not a psychologist. But he was consistent, I would say, in this debate with his past. Once I figured out what he was doing, and I sat back and took notes on that, The rest of it was, okay, let's see if we can have any sort of discussion at all. Can he talk about divine hiddenness? Can he answer any questions? And he accused me of tap dancing around answers. We'll get to that when we do the full edited debate review. But the Discovery Institute is famous for their opposition to evolution. Now, he's a Catholic, and Catholics don't necessarily oppose evolution, but my understanding is that he does, or at least the Discovery Institute does. And the Discovery Institute, the people involved there, they don't present evidence for creation. They just constantly try to poke holes in evolutionary science, and they go after evolutionary scientists. What Dr. Egnor did was completely consistent with that. He didn't present any evidence for a God. He just tried to poke holes in my understanding of God. And in many ways, this is even worse, because he didn't defend his yes answer to, is there a God? He tried to show up to suggest Matt doesn't understand. Is Matt qualified to discuss this, which is irrelevant to the subject of the debate? Does Matt understand Aquinas the way that I do? He acknowledges this. He tried to poke holes in me, and then by inference suggest that this poked holes in the new atheists, and then suggest that this poked holes in anyone who has any objections to God, hoping that God would win out by default, not because any evidence was presented or anything reasonable was discussed about, there's really good reason to think there is a God. Going back to his blog post for a moment, he quoted my opening and had some objections to it. From my opening, I said, quote, normally I point out in these debates that I'm not here to defend a no, because the burden of proof is on those who say there's a yes. It's not up to atheists to prove a God doesn't exist. So today, I'm just going to say no, there's not a God, in the same way that there aren't leprechauns and fairies. That's all he presented, not my actual argument from divine hiddenness, the thing that I started talking about earlier. And he didn't honestly present my appeal to leprechauns and fairies. I wasn't putting God equal to leprechauns and fairies, which is what he presents and what he's really, really upset about. What I was saying is that when it comes to claims, if you're willing to say no, fairies don't exist, even though there's no way to absolutely prove it, you can, on the same grounds, suggest that no, God doesn't exist, because there isn't evidence to confirm it. It's a colloquialism. It's how we speak. Anybody who thinks they could absolutely prove that something doesn't exist, if the proposition is unfalsifiable, doesn't understand what falsifiability means. If you claim to have falsified the unfalsifiable, now you're in the depths of irrationality. He objects to my opening by saying, quote, both sides in a debate have a burden of proof that denial of God's existence entails evidence and logic that needs to be explained no less than the affirmation of God's existence does. The claim by new atheists that their ideology has no evidence, logic, or proof is absurd and frankly cowardly. Well, I'm sorry that he doesn't understand the burden of proof, but for propositional logic, if the proposition is some God exists, that proposition needs to be supported by evidence and argument. The rejection of that proposition does not. If I were to say no God exists, that would be a proposition, which I did say, which required evidence and argument, which I presented. But if I say I do not accept your proposition, some God exists, I have no burden of proof for not accepting something. And to hold that somehow that God's proof should be accepted until the atheists disprove it is an absolute shifting of the burden of proof. You haven't made your case, and therefore nobody has to prove that your case is wrong. But even if I do, if I prove that your case is flawed, that doesn't disprove that it doesn't prove that a God doesn't exist. It just proves your argument was wrong. This is basic stuff that Dr. Egnor doesn't understand, the basic foundations of logical arguments and what needs to happen in order to demonstrate something. Curiously, I presented an argument against God existing and did not rely merely on a burden of proof discussion, and I expressly pointed this out. But Dr. Egnor had a script and a plan, and me presenting an argument threw him off of his script. By coincidence, I decided this is one where I'm going to go ahead and defend the actual proposition that no, God doesn't exist, probably for the first time ever, and did it loosely so we could have a discussion. And me presenting an argument threw him off his script, which is why his closing and his arguments felt so disjointed. There wasn't even an attempt to address my argument ever because he came there to expose me instead of debate the topic. In his delusional mind, showing that I didn't know an argument or a detail about an argument on the spot means that all new atheists fail to address or fail to understand these ancient arguments that are debunked over and over. He wrote in his blog post, "The inescapable inference is that atheism has a very short supply of logic and evidence, and atheists will do whatever they can to avoid explaining themselves." Let's think about this. This shows you the type of dishonest individual and dishonest arguer Dr. Egnor is. The fact I could be a complete babbling buffoon idiot who knows nothing, which is clearly what he thinks, and I don't give a fuck what he thinks. I could be that, and that wouldn't tell you anything about any other atheist, and it certainly wouldn't tell you anything about atheism, and it doesn't do anything to prove that his God exists. This is what I mean about consistency. These people want to knock down evolution because if they think they knock down evolution, that props up creation. And that's not how it actually works. He thinks if he knocks me down, he takes out new atheism and his God wins by default. This is literally what he's saying. The inescapable inference, wrong, is that atheism, wrong, has a very short supply of logic and evidence, wrong, and atheists will do whatever they can to avoid explaining themselves. This from the guy who in the debate said that I wasn't an atheist, called me a liar, and then kept pointing out that I was talking, or claiming I was talking nonsense and gibberish. If I had just shown up in this debate and said, yeah, those arguments from Aquinas have been disregarded over and over. I've done videos on them. Countless atheist philosophers have done videos on them, written books on them, those things. Haven't you read them? That would be dishonest. Because we're there to have a discussion about the arguments that each of us present in that moment. We're not there to defend the veracity of all of new atheism or all of Christendom. I showed up to have a discussion, and he showed up to be an ass, and he was very good at it. He was so good at it that I got 4 emails from an anonymous fan of his. I'll only read you 2 because the other 2 demonstrate the creepiness of his fan, who posted a picture from my wedding and spoke disparagingly of my ex-wife through 2 whole emails. The first email, and when I say it's from an email address, which is clearly fake, but it says, "Debate Michael Egnor again, you cowardly fat fuck. Or do you need a debate fee like you need a fuck fee to get pussy from your wife?" And then he quotes Dr. Egnor. "Both sides in a debate have a burden of proof. The denial of God's existence entails evidence and logic." Literally, this is a cut and paste from Egnor's blog that this guy sent me. Now, I suppose this could be Dr. Egnor. I kind of doubt it, because while he's an ass, I don't think he's the kind of ass that would create a fake email account to call me a cuck, and because that's what the third email was. I'm not going to read it, but I just found out, well, I'll read part of it. "I just found out you were a cuck this whole time. I had a hunch, and now I'm all shocked, but I'm glad I got a confirmation from a reliable source. Oh my God, yes, God, you fat fucking pig, that you are in fact a cuck," and then goes on to talk shit about my ex-wife and other stuff. This is the email that I got for doing a debate against a fellow with the Discovery Institute who showed up not to debate does God exist, but to debate is Matt knowledgeable at all on these subjects. Now, the full debate review, where in this, like I said, I'm going to do this for the first time ever, is going to be me chopping up the video to get rid of the fluff and the argument and that stuff, and talk about what was actually said and what was claimed. Because he accused me of speaking nonsense and gibberish, which I don't think I have or did, and of tap dancing, yet he's the one who failed to clearly answer questions. He was one who failed to clearly present an argument, and he did that intentionally and admitted it. And he's the one who failed to even attempt a rebuttal of his opponent's argument. I at least tried to address them, despite being up against a brick wall of idiocy. But he didn't even make an attempt to address my argument. He just wanted to go on and on about burden of proof and then try to claim that I don't know anything. It's embarrassing that this man is a professor, but I'm at least glad that he seems to be a capable neurosurgeon. I've heard good stories about him helping people with serious brain issues, even if his own brain has been corrupted with irrational religious woo and flawed epistemology. The next debate will be up, following debate review will be up next month, but I wanted to get this out now. No, I won't be debating Dr. Egnor again for the same reason I don't want to debate Ray Comfort again, because neither of them have any understanding of or respect for the debate process. Neither of them are honest interlocutors. Both of them have disparaging views of atheists. The only difference between Ray Comfort and Dr. Egnor is that Ray will at least pretend that he loves the atheist, or maybe perhaps he actually does love the atheist, while Dr. Egnor openly hates us. When I get the other debate review done, I'll post it. In the meantime, take care of yourself. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.